I don't like doing my own home repairs, and when I made some videos that honestly show how much I don't like it, they seem to help a lot of other guys like me. So I thought it would be good to make this new set of videos. Guys like me have a million questions for the progressive activists that we see on the news, but nobody on TV ever asks those questions. On CNN, the host probably agrees with the activists, so his questions are weak. And on Fox News, the host just tries to make them look bad. Either way, nobody's asking the questions that might actually help us get a feel for where they're coming from, so we might actually understand them a little better. It's no surprise that people who disagree over politics are so angry at each other nowadays. So right before Christmas, me and my brother, who is himself progressive, we drove around the West and did our own interviews. We drove to 22 cities and interviewed dozens of people who support progressive causes to ask those questions that are never asked. We're not trying to change their mind or make them look bad. We just want to understand where they're coming from. These folks were brave, considering what can happen nowadays if you say one wrong thing on YouTube. And we talked about a lot of really sensitive subjects, so just leave right now if these conversations might offend you. If you stay though, I think you'll hear some things you've never heard before and have a better understanding of your fellow Americans. I did. We left Las Cruces for Albuquerque to meet Stephen Verchinski, who's the chair of the city's Green Party and was a Bernie Sanders delegate and a career policy expert with the Bureau of Land Management.
My name is Stephen Verchinski, and I'm the chair of the Green Party of the Albuquerque metropolitan area. I have a background in natural resources management and policy. I've been an independent for quite a number of years until the Sanders campaign came about, and worked on his campaign tirelessly for a good part of a year to where I became the at-large delegate for the state of New Mexico and actually went to the convention in Philadelphia. I was one of the first people, I think, to walk out of the convention when people were yelling, walk out, walk out. It was after Mr. Khan came in and started holding up the Constitution and berating Donald Trump, of all people. And I'm going, well, perhaps maybe he should have read that same document to his son to make him realize that what he was doing was going to a war that was undeclared. And as a volunteer into that system, he was going to do bloody job and bloody work for money.
Do you have that opinion about all war or just this particular war?
Well, we haven't had a legal war since World War II. And we
Do you
try to
think
cover it up.
But it sounds like you do believe that there is such a thing as a legal war at some point, though.
I think it's a matter of conscience in large measure as well, because the whole idea of defense versus offense, a justifiable war, I mean, if you're defending yourself, I'm not going to allow you to go ahead and knock my head open. But by the same token, I'm not spoiling for a fight. I would rather have a dialogue with people and find out what their problems are. Yeah.
And this is why I wanted to do these interviews, is because I can respect somebody who says, I don't like this war, but I think a lot of conservatives have a problem with someone that says, I think all war is bad.
Well, we used to have an Office of War in the United States versus a Defense Department that really doesn't look like defense, but a military operation gone rogue.
Okay, so but what's the point? I mean, that's a clever turn of a phrase. Sure, they call it the Defense Department. They're in the PR business. But my question was, do you think there are any wars that would be just?
Well, I haven't really seen any of them that really were justified in the last 2 centuries.
I think a lot of people would say, let's argue about which wars are just and not just, but let's not argue that there is no right to self-defense for a country or for a person. Would it be fair to say that there is a right to self-defense?
Oh, there is totally a right to self-defense for a person, yeah.
Okay, good. So continue. You were telling us about what happened at the convention.
I walked out of the convention with a number of other people and ended up in the wrong tent, the media tent, and we were told we were all going to be placed under arrest. Took the American flag and turned it upside down, and spoke with people from South Korea.
I'm sorry,
Japan.
You did that? Or?
Yeah, South Korea and China, and told them that we were in trouble. We had a election that Nobody talked about the fraud that was taking place. I don't know if you remember that as the primary progressed, the exit polls versus the actual counts varied wider and wider and wider, to where even Jimmy Carter wouldn't certify this election, and that was done on our machines. And so I went to Edison Research and had a bit of outrage because the company refused. This was the one that was hired by all the mainstream media to do the exit polls, and they refused to release the raw polling data to the courts, which, having been in law enforcement, if you don't have probable cause that you can present to the court, you're stuck. You can't get warrants, you can't get anything going. So Edison did their work, but what they didn't do is they didn't release the materials to the courts, which would have proved election fraud at that point. Also, to add on to it, Larry Rosen, the owner of the company, plays golf with Donald Trump.
Okay, well,
so
you could chase these rabbit trails all day long.
Well, the rabbit trails are sometimes exactly what they are.
Great, you're right. You're right, and I shouldn't poo-poo what seems like a smoking gun.
Yeah.
Let's get back to something you said about the flag. For a lot of people, the flag is something that I get choked up about it, et cetera, and it really bothers me when people use it as part of a protest. I think it does them more harm than good, because it simply turns a whole segment of the population against you. Obviously, you don't feel that way, because you did you protested using a flag, and I don't want to confront you on that like it's some bad thing to do. But do you think it was a good idea to do that? Do you think it helped your cause to do that?
It brought attention nationally that we were totally dissatisfied with that outcome. We had no floor fight that occurred, and I was expecting one, but instead there was a full capitulation and a request that we stay through the convention. And well...
That's right, there was Bernie that made that request, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh well.
So there it goes.
Well, that sounds like a clever thing to do then. And admittedly, it seems like a risky thing to do. You're going to get the press, but you're also going to turn off some folks. So
well, and the other thing is that they were threatening to arrest us for, what we were looking for was the exit to walk out of the entire convention. And obviously somebody didn't want us walking out en masse out of the convention halls. They wanted us still kept there, and even with the threat of arrest.
What do you think that means and you've heard of all the things that have happened, been exposed about the Democratic Party and Donna Brazil's book and things like that. What does their behavior do to what you're trying to do in the field?
Well, what I did is I did exit. I exited the Democratic Party. Still maintain relationships with friends and that were still trying to reform the party. But I looked at myself critically and said, where are my ideals most allied? And checked out the platforms of a number of the parties, because the Democratic Party just rescinded a lot of the things that we're looking at going forward. And I said, well, I can't stick with this. The Republican Party, I don't know what they stand for anymore, really, other than transferring of wealth and playing Santa Claus when need be, and then the Democrats raise the taxes, and they play this game that's a duopoly more than anything else at this point.
You're a technical person who's dealt with models, who deals with ecosystems and whatnot, if I understand your career correctly. You understand better than most people the deficiencies of those models. And what worries me about the current debate is that when people say the science is settled, they're saying that based on models that, as I would hope you would say, have no guarantee to be accurate.
I would disagree at this point. That I believe that we've spent a lot of time on this issue, and the modeling is fairly clear in the predictions. The question is how bad it may get. And at this point, what we may be looking at, according to some of the scientists, is that we're looking at a catastrophe coming up that we won't have the resilience to cope with. We have about 20 days worth of food in storage in the United States. 20 days. Okay. The time period of Jefferson warned us. He said, we had a year without a summer in this journal. And that was just because one volcano going off and adding all of that additional soot and everything into the atmosphere, causing a massive cooling event worldwide, with the estimate of over 100,000 people dying in Europe alone of famine during that time period. We do not have the resilience if the models are anywhere close to 80 or 90% correct.
So for the skeptics like me who say, well, if those models were so good, why were they saying, 20 years ago they were talking about global cooling?
Well, that's correct. I mean, that's why we ended up sending up the satellites and got more imagery. I mean, the International Geophysical Year only took place in late 1950s, when we were first sending things up into space to go and do monitoring. But now, in order to go ahead and shut that down, when you don't go ahead and continue funding that, and instead what you look at is, for example, here in New Mexico, is having a space command for launching, space weaponry into outer orbit of the planet. I mean, where's our priority?
We see arguments to the contrary. None of those arguments in your mind are convincing.
No, because internal debate on what a model does or does not include is first off healthy skepticism, but once that's done and the scientists have come to a consensus on it, because they do what is a basic equivalent of a citizens' action roundtable, is they all get together, they all meet together and say, there's going to be disagreement one versus another, but eventually they settle on out pretty good as to where they're going to be heading.
You'll find folks on the other side of the aisle.
Well, usually they've been paid by the industry to go ahead and say what they need to say, and I don't see any other reason for them to be doing that. Yeah.
The objection I hear is that so much funding is simply tied to politics now, that if you are a skeptic on this, if you are somebody who decides to say, well, maybe the science isn't settled, maybe I'll try to get a grant to do this, well, that puts you on the outside. I mean, is it,
no,
how do you...
not really. I mean, I watched what was happening, for example, during the Clinton administration. They had close to 400 studies on mercury deposition alone from fossil fuel power plants that were not being funded by the National Science Foundation for some reason or another. And I look at it as being as the equivalent that was done with Obama and Standing Rock, and saying that, well, somebody had to go ahead and tell the Army Corps of Engineers not to do a full environmental impact statement on a pipeline that was that long, contrary to all policies that they had internally to that particular agency. Is that something that's that big does an environmental impact statement, not just a minor assessment.
Okay.
And so we're seeing this, and it's progressing even worse now, because what we're now seeing is that let's forget about this entirely. Let's go ahead and throw out all of the EPA, get rid of it entirely, and devil take the hindmost, and let's bring federalism on back to the states level and whatever the states want to do. But we're all in this together. We're all in the same boat. This is our planetary spaceship, so to speak. And until we get it through everybody's heads that everybody has to work on this together, the species may not survive. I mean, that's how radical it is right now. That some of the scientists are posing that your species may not survive on the planet. Anywhere between a 3 to 4 degrees Celsius rise could wipe out most, if not all, of our ability to grow food crops. Well, I mean, what would you do if you were confronted with it and you were the elite and said, well, this is what's happening, how do I defend myself against this and my family and my resources? What would you do?
If the stakes are too high, you don't gamble.
Right.
Is it correct?
Yeah, so what do you do to your populations? Our humanity is all tied together, not apart. To give you an idea how this interconnects, a scientist finds out here in the western United States that we get 40% additional rainfall from a dust particle that comes all the way from the Taklamakan Desert in western China. That's amazing. And that's science, not something that somebody is saying that I think this is happening. This is actually documented. And so what do we do with that information when we find out that China decides that, well, they want to go ahead and pave over at thousands of square kilometers annually their desert area? We don't have any discussion about that. The discussion revolves around, well, everybody has to have more renewable energy, which is a growth paradigm, versus something that says maybe what we really want is security in our food, clothing, shelter, fuel, and not much more than that.
What it sounds like you're saying, okay, you're a professional in this, you know the science well, and it is complex. It's like most things, the more you look at it, the more complex it gets, bizarrely complex. But the solution that you see is that these things that are happening, they can be so catastrophic to the planet that we need to do something. And the we in this case means not the industry, not the people, but the governments. Well, I guess the...
No, I say that it's the responsibility of all of us, but you don't get there with a large D or a large R in the back of your name and saying that this is how we solve the problem. Is it's top down. If we had the ability for the public to look at it from the standpoint of even the science on it and what we don't know, for example, the precautionary principle, I think people would be a little bit more hesitant to go full speed ahead, for example, with fracking in the United States, because there's too many unknowns. Like this area that we're sitting on right here, that top of the mountain right there that you see, in this top of the Sandias, the uppermost layer of the Sandias is thousands of feet below us. We're in a rift valley and we don't even know how this formed. But this is connected, the scientists now know, this is connected to Yellowstone and the grand supervolcano that's up there. So if you mess in this area, does it have an impact up there or vice versa? We don't know. So when you have those types of unknowns, do you go full speed ahead? I don't know all the answers, of course. You don't know all the answers, of course. So the question is where do we go with that, what we have and what we don't know?
So ends this interview in our Drive to Understand series. I'm so glad Stephen Verchinski didn't call me a denier. He asked simple, powerful questions, like, since neither of us have all the answers, what would you do if you were in charge? Most of all, though, he wasn't sanctimonious. Being smug and insulting is so ineffective. I wonder if the folks who act that way are even trying to get people on their side on climate change. I get the impression they might just be trying to score points in the culture war, or trying to sell a book or a website. But Stephen Verchinski did none of that, and I'm grateful and better informed. I hope you may want to support this series by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Thanks.